Hello and welcome to the Psychosynthesis podcast, where my friend and colleague Alan and I reflect and muse and chat about psychosynthesis. So what are we getting into this week, Alan?
Well, Ryan, let's carry on our journey through my new book, The Act of Imagination. So, I think in episode 1 last time we were talking about the prologue and the introduction. And today begins the journey into the meat of the book, so chapter 1 proper, which is on the teachings of psychosynthesis.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously I have read it,
Yes.
so I know what it's about. But could you say a few words for anyone listening? Just kind of the theme, what you were trying to get across in that chapter?
Well, I was trying to clarify what the teachings of psychosynthesis are. I mean, that's the top line. I think, as we mentioned last time, there's an elusiveness to psychosynthesis. It's a slippery topic. It's difficult to pin down what it is exactly. So that was. So I'm just carrying over that question and now addressing the teachings of psychosynthesis by turning the twin principles that I established earlier. The twin principles that I've argued run all the way through psychosynthesis. That it is an experience, not just an idea or a technique, it's an experience. There's different ways to think about it, and that's what the teachings are. And also it's an experience of synthesis. It's a particular experience, not just any old experience. So the teachings are ways to think about and notice and reflect on the experience of synthesis. That's the argument, and then I set out to establish that based on Assagioli's writings.
Yeah, so those principles that you mentioned, you have derived them from Assagioli's own work.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's there. You can definitely see it in how he writes about psychosynthesis.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so you're taking us through in this chapter the key experiences, let's say, psychosynthesis, which may be formally, as this is the contribution you're making, right? That sometimes in training or in other books, they're presented as concepts or theories. So what's so important about not presenting them in that way?
Yeah, I mean the framework that's offered to try and clarify the elusiveness of psychosynthesis that a lot of people draw upon is the core concepts that Furman and Gila offer. So they've got a short paper called The 7 Core Concepts of Psychosynthesis Training, which is based upon a very short paper that Assagioli wrote called Training. And in that training, he gives 12 points which he considers are important to recognise and include in any psychosynthesis training. Which is why Furman and Gila, and also Kenneth Sorensen, he's got a version of the core concepts as well, draw upon that paper. And in the second point in that paper, he lists 7 of his teachings, which we'll get into perhaps. And he calls these 7 teachings the sine qua non of psychosynthesis.
Latin scholars out there
will know what that means. But I think it just means like the essence or the sort of heart of, or the essence, the essential elements of psychosynthesis. And I remember when I read that. You remember reading that the first time? I mean, I was really impressed with it when I read it the first
which
time.
the concept.
The Furman and Gila paper.
Yeah, I didn't encounter them while I was a student. I didn't even
Really?
go to that list when I was a student. No, it's only afterwards. So I don't really remember.
Wow.
Mm.
I often recommend it to students. I mean, it's really good, and it does clarify a lot about those 7 teachings, both the Furman and Gila one and the Kenneth Sorensen one. The problem is, Assagioli doesn't call them concepts, everybody.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
well, a concept is a particular word, and to call them the core concepts definitely moves our understanding of psychosynthesis towards a sort of conceptual basis.
Yeah.
And anyway, long story short, when you actually look at the source material from Assagioli, what does he call this list of 7 teachings that are that Furman and Gila call concepts? He calls them experiences.
Yeah, which is significant. And obviously, that was probably the inspiration for you, or the hook that got you into kind of.
Well, it's just another place where there's evidence that psychosynthesis is about an experience.
That confirmed an intuition as well for you. Yeah. I suppose one thing that jumps out to me, and might do for other, your book's coming out soon. By the time this podcast comes out, some people may have the book in front of them. And it strikes me as a bit of an elephant in the room around those 7 core experiences or concepts, which is surprising if you have discovered psychosynthesis in other ways, or even through the training that we're part of, where the concept of subpersonalities is right up front.
Right.
For a lot of people.
When they learn about psychosynthesis.
And there's a kind of significant absence there, which might be surprising to someone. I don't know if you've got, without going off on a tangent about it, I don't know if you've got any kind of words to say about that. Why is that? Why do you think that's...
Well, I mean, Sajali did write about subpersonalities, but as I understand it, he didn't particularly emphasize them. They were subsequently emphasized quite a bit in how psychosynthesis got developed in the States, in San Francisco, and Vargu and others, Furman and Gila, developed that. So I think it is a well-used piece of psychosynthesis theory, but it's not one of these essential 7 experiences. I mean, I would say a subpersonality is a way of thinking about an experience. You can meet figures in dreams. Are they subpersonalities? Maybe they are. An Aboriginal Australian wouldn't call them a subpersonality. They'd think they were ancestors or spirit guides or something. So I think subpersonality theory is really useful. It's a way of thinking about the characters that we meet in psychological life as subparts of our psychology or personality. But yeah, it's not there. It's not there. I mean, I talk much more about that in the 2nd chapter, the techniques and how to work with such characters.
Yeah.
But no, it's
anyway. I just thought I'd kind of raise it just in case people were going, "Why is that not in that list?" But I suppose what you're saying is basically the core principle that you were applying here will apply to understanding the subpersonalities as well.
Yes, exactly.
Just treat them. It's a little label to give to a set of experiences, a cluster of experiences. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. So yeah, I mean, when I first read the core concepts paper, I was quite excited because I was like, at last, this is what psychosynthesis is. If you've got some evidence of these 7 core concepts, all good. And also, the tricky thing is that works really well on paper, but when you transfer over into real life, like doing psychosynthesis therapy, Like, how do you know that the therapist's using the core concepts? You don't, because,
Yes.
and I mean, sometimes they don't even use the words. I mean, how I do therapy these days, I don't use any of the terminology of psychosynthesis. I'm thinking about it perhaps, but I wouldn't say it out loud. Disidentification, ideal model. I wouldn't,
Mm.
for reasons that we'll get into later. So but okay, so maybe the therapist's using it in their mind, but then you have to interview them. Like, are you
Mm.
doing that?
Mm.
But then the crunch comes because it's like, well, which particular understanding do you have of? Maybe we'll just list them briefly. So you've got personal self, you've got the will, strong, skillful, good. You've got disidentification, the ideal model, the superconscious, the transpersonal self, and synthesis. If you ask any given psychosynthesis therapist, what do you mean by one of these things, they'll probably give you a more or less but different answer to another psychosynthesis therapist.
Mm.
So that begs the question, which is the correct one? And then that's a problem as well, because the Saggiuli doesn't give definitions. He doesn't give a nice little glossary for how we're meant to understand these things. He positively avoids defining his terms. I mean, in the book I quote him as to why he avoids definitions, because definitions are limiting. So as soon as you say this is this, then you identify it with the abstract description. And he's quite clear that the language that we use, the theories that we have, are not the same as the experiences that they point towards. There's a gap between the theory and the experience. So he doesn't want to pin it down in that way. So but then we still need to say what these things are to have some kind of shared understanding. So what he does is he indicates. He talks about indications, how you can indicate what the experience is in different ways through experiential description, abstract ideas, metaphors. Comparing them to each other is a big part of what he does, and I talk about that in this chapter quite a bit. And then in the round, through reading in different ways in different places, you begin to get an understanding on a theoretical level and an experiential level for what all these teachings might be. But it's elusive because there's no one single place to say what they are. So that was the task I set myself in the chapter, to sort of clarify that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I kind of, I suppose what comes up for me when you describe that is Assagioli's esoteric roots. Because what I hear there is the same sort of relationship between experience and concept, or experience and dogma, that you find in many religious traditions and spiritual traditions and esoteric traditions. So there's a kind of a Sufism there about the fact that, okay, we can write something, there's a kind of a surface level truth, let's say, that we can capture in words, we can put on paper, we can put in a dogma, in a set of beliefs. But that's only the start. There's layers and layers and layers. And there is a process. In esoteric traditions, maybe a more structured, formal process of initiation into certain levels of truth, and then but the important thread throughout those esoteric traditions is a guide. And so what comes up for me when you're describing that is how important is the guide in psychosynthesis. And
it's the teacher, the therapist,
Yeah.
etc.
To guide the student from the concept to the experience. I don't know.
100%. I think what I write about is that along those lines, not quite in that language, but there's we'll get into that in chapter 3 in a couple of episodes' time. the influences of psychosynthesis, the esoteric roots of psychosynthesis. But what I write about in chapter 1 is the implicit modus operandi, more Latin, the implicit modus operandi, by which I mean the implicit culture that exists in psychosynthesis training, that's passed on from teachers to students and then from therapists to clients. There is a sort of, by implicit I mean like not spelled out, not made clear, not made explicit. There's a way of being. There's a sort of, there's assumptions that you pick up between what's said. And I was trying to articulate that in chapter 1, begin to articulate that in chapter 1 and throughout the book. I was trying to put on paper the assumptions that we bring to psychosynthesis, for good and ill, and to make them more conscious and to think them through. And I think you're absolutely right, because that means you are learning through experience. Then there's something communicated in these relationships that bring the text to life,
and maybe some trust as well there, that the person that's guiding you has some experience that they're drawing on.
100%. It's so important to have, teacherly authority is maybe a sort of, it's almost like a dangerous thing to say these days, but in a healthy sense, to be able to learn, you need to give some respect. You need to find a teacher that you respect, that you trust, that you can open up to, and then hopefully there are teachers that have that authority and like they're that bit further ahead of you and can pass something along. So that's the initiation that you talk about.
Yeah. I suppose it depends what their authority is rooted in. Is their authority rooted in a kind of very...
I'm the teacher. You should listen to me.
I understand the concepts.
Right.
Rather than I have experienced this. That's a bit different.
Yeah, you want your teacher to stand in the authority of their experience. Not some kind of institutional position or dogmatic understanding. Yeah, that would...
Difficult thing to measure as well, though.
Yeah, there's no measure for that. It's probably all a bit of mix of all those different things. But yeah.
Yeah, okay, so you've got these seven different I'm hesitant now to call them concepts.
Experiences.
They were originally called concepts, but now...
No, they were originally called experiences.
All right.
And then Furman and Gieler turned them into concepts.
Called them concepts. And now
and now I'm turning them back into experiences.
To the original meaning, which was experience.
Yes.
And what you're saying is, even in... So as the principle is there in Assagioli. The principles are there, are experience and synthesis there in his original text. And yet, in the way that even Assagioli tried to capture these and write them down, there's a bit of a divergence sometimes in how these concepts or experiences are presented. So sometimes they are more presented as concepts, like so in the abstract or conceptual, and sometimes the emphasis is much more on the experience and synthesis.
Yeah,
and you're trying to name that in the material and draw out the kind of experiential meaning more so.
Yeah, I mean you planted this seed for me, so it's all your fault, Ryan, because I remember sitting with you in Caravan Cafe behind King's Cross Station one day. We were having lunch together, and you said, of course, Assagioli's teaching's not, what did you say? Not coherent, or not... it's got inconsistencies in it. It's not a unified system, I think was the phrase you used. And I just ran with that. And what I do in the chapter is I take statements from Assagioli, because if he doesn't define it, you need to take multiple statements. I think that's a weakness in some books on psychosynthesis. They just cherry pick one or two quotes to base their presentation on.
Yes.
But I've gone beyond that.
Understandably.
Say again?
Understandably, in a way, it's...
Well, it's easier,
Yes.
and it allows you to simplify the teachings. It takes away the complexity and it takes away the inconsistency. So what I've done is I found basically what I find is that broadly speaking, there's two groups of statements that run throughout Assagioli's presentation. So you can see quite clearly one group of statements where he describes these experiences as experiences of synthesis. So that aligns with my argument through the book about a principial basis for the whole project. And then elsewhere, he makes statements on the same teachings, and yet he describes them using quite a different language. So that the experiential synthesis statements, they tend to avoid jargonistic phrases. They tend to just be simple, everyday descriptive language. The other group of statements employ a much more abstract analytical terminology in describing the same experiences, and you end up when you sort of group them together like that and consider them, they're quite different, and there's a tension between them, which might be fine because psychosynthesis doesn't have an orthodoxy, and there's no one way of thinking about psychosynthesis experiences. I'm not arguing that there is. What I am saying though is it becomes problematic when this contradictory way of speaking isn't acknowledged, and it can be very confusing for the reader, the student, because they're like, oh, I thought it was this and now it's that, and that's when I was a student, that was just a background confusion. It's all become clear to me why I was a bit confused. So I go through all the teaching experiences and reflect on the differences.
Can you ground it a bit in one concept?
Yeah. Well, I think the key one is disidentification. Yeah, let's ground it in disidentification. So disidentification is such a key experience. I mean, all psychosynthesis is some version of the disidentification process. So if you look in, for example, Assagioli's main book, Psychosynthesis, Manual of Principles and Techniques, there's the exercise in disidentification, which is a technique, which is a particular way of disidentifying, and that's preceded by a description of what disidentification is. So in that description of what disidentification is, he basically says that, well, let's back up. Disidentification is the opposite of identification. So in true psychosynthesis fashion, let's say what something is by saying what it's not. So identification is where you restrict your psychological experience, your expression, your perceptions to a narrow range, and that becomes familiar and habitual, and that cuts you off from your broader potential. So you might identify as a calm person because you feel calm all the time and you think in a calm way and you express yourself in a calm way, and fair enough, you might be forgiven for saying I'm identified as a calm person, and that's not wrong, but it is a limitation because an identification is a restriction, and it will keep you calm and stop you from feeling joy, from feeling excitement, also from feeling angry or upset. And these are all important human experiences to have. It's not that we always want to be angry or always want to feel excited, but we want to be able to move through and respond appropriately to circumstances. But if we're always calm, that's a limitation. So disidentification Sajuli describes it as occasioned by simply turning your attention to the world of psychological facts, the psychological events. So he talks about an introspection. So basically, he says, if you turn your attention to your experience, so you think you're a calm person, and you do that for long enough in a sustained way, you start to notice that you're not just calm, that at the edges of your awareness you're a bit anxious or a bit excited. And then, very simply, in and of itself, that is a disidentification, because now you're not just calm, now you're also a little bit anxious and a little bit excited and calm. And so you start to think, well, maybe I'm not just a calm person. Who am I? And that becomes unclear now, because it can't just be that identification with being calm. Now and that's just in terms of feelings, but of course it's not just feelings. That's just a simple example. It's also about how you think, how you move, how you see the world, how you relate to people.
It can be very disorientating.
Well, yes, and that's how, again, Sajuli acknowledges that. He says that it can be a state of, paraphrasing, he says, disidentification can be an unsettling period, a transitional period in which we can feel quite vulnerable and limited. And he uses the analogy of the chrysalis, which is, I like it so much that I quote it twice in the book, but this is the first place where I quote it. So he says that disidentification is as if we are the caterpillar going through the process of transformation in the chrysalis. It's like we're giving up on our caterpillar, our old life, our old identification, but we've not yet turned into the beautiful butterfly. We're in this kind of time between stories, is how I talk about it. The old caterpillar story, the new butterfly story. And which makes sense, right? Because if you're like identified and then you start to let go of that, but you've not quite established yourself in a new identification, because you just end up identifying with something new, but hopefully more expansive, it can be a bit scary. A bit like when you move school, you're at the little school, you're a kid, you get to 11 or 12, and then there's the summer holidays, and then you go from being the oldest kid in the small school with not many students, and you know all the teachers, and then suddenly you're in a much bigger school, and you're the youngest kid, and you don't know what the hell's going on. You have to move around classrooms and stuff. That's a transition. That's a disidentification from being a primary school student to a secondary school student.
Yeah. There's something I really like in the way you present. I think it's not just in that process, but there's a couple of points where you kind of position disidentification as part of a process of change. As you know, I think maybe that was even in Sajogli's work somewhere. Was it the idea that there's a kind of natural emergence or a natural process of change, of disidentifying from one identity going on to the next, which is interesting because often I think it is presented as kind of like an ideal state,
right?
And what that implies is that actually our identifications are as necessary as our as disidentification, in that there is this process of disidentify, disidentify.
Yes. Yeah, it's just, Sajuli talks about successive identifications, or is it successive disidentifications? I get mixed up, but basically there's no one big disidentification done and dusted. So you become a secondary school student, and then you leave secondary school, you go to university, and then you leave university and maybe you get a job or something, and then you get married or something, and then you get to the midlife crisis. That's the classic disidentification. And then you start to get old and your body starts to break down, and that's another disidentification. So it's like, it is a natural process. Again, it's a naturally occurring experience. And people can struggle in these transitional periods. They want to hold on to being a caterpillar. They think something's wrong. They don't want to move forwards. And that's ostensibly what psychosynthesis therapy is all about. It's about helping people in this transitional period. Now, you mentioned the idealized state that gets mistaken for disidentification. let's get into that. Because I think, so thus far I've described disidentification as an experience, but it's also a synthesis. Because as you recognize that you're not just calm, you're now anxious and a little bit excited. So you've synthesized excitement and anxiety with calm. So it's a more complex system now. It's a greater whole. And that's all there. And he describes it in a very temporal fashion. He doesn't describe where that's going to lead you to. He just says it's a process that happens over time, and you go through these successive disidentifications. So I think in those statements that he makes, you can very much see that disidentification is an experiential synthesis. However, there's a whole bunch of other statements that he makes which move disidentification into a much more sort of abstract analytical territory. And I think I certainly misunderstood it in several ways, and misapplied it, I think, to be fair, for a long time in several different ways, partly as a result of the more abstract analytical presentation, which in the book I use the exercise in disidentification, which is also called the self-identification exercise, as a source to critique some of these misunderstandings of disidentification. One of which is what I call, should we just go through them in turn, and that will probably help. So the first one's outcome separation.
This is the kind of very philosophically meaty bit. So I think you've got this, So
you've got to get your philosophy straight before you do your psychology. Yeah. So what's the basic assumptions behind the exercise in disidentification? So I talk about outcome separation, a center separation, a control separation, and a cognitive separation. So separation is the opposite of synthesis. So if we're separating from experience, perhaps unwittingly, it's not really what we're trying to do, but unwittingly, if that's what we end up doing, that's not really what psychosynthesis is about. Synthesis is all about joining up to more and more of your experience, not separating off from aspects of experience. So the first separation, outcome separation, is a danger because in the exercise in disidentification, you repeat these affirmations. So the idea is you close your eyes, you make yourself comfortable, and then you repeat to yourself over and over again, I have a body, and there's a few descriptions of your body, and then you say, and I am not this body, and then you go, I have feelings, and I'm not these feelings, and then you go, I have thoughts, and I am not these thoughts, and then you end up affirming, I am a center of consciousness and will. Okay, now that might be fine, but the danger is that because it's an affirmation, and it sagittarially instructs you to go find evidence for that affirmation in your experience. You're starting with a theory, I am a center of consciousness and will, and then you're looking for the experiential equivalent, and well, you find it, don't you? Because there's a sort of confirmation bias.
Well, I love this quote just a nice little line. There are no surprises with affirmations.
Yeah, you find what you expect, which is that you are a center of consciousness and will. Now, there's a couple of things about that. The first one is that might be a good description of the outcome of disidentification. It might be. I'm open to that. But the emphasis is on achieving the outcome. And if you remember from the last time, we were talking about what is synthesis. Synthesis is the process of gathering together disparate elements and the outcome of that in a greater whole. So any psychosynthesis technique on a principial basis, you would want to see it having a process and an outcome.
Mm.
The exercise in disidentification pretty much just focuses on the outcome.
Okay, I've got a little...
Go for it.
There's no such thing as anything without a process. That's one thing.
I'll buy into that. Yeah.
So it's about the nature of the process in this situation. So as a devil's advocate question, what if believing in the outcome, believing in the I, believing in the self, believing in that model is part of the process? What if that's an essential part of that process?
That you have to have a particular belief system for it to work?
Maybe.
Well, that would be weird for several different reasons. Well, if you're talking about psychosynthesis psychotherapy, I'd like to think we don't need to convert our clients to a particular belief system for the therapy to work. I mean, maybe they pick up on your belief system implicitly by the way that you operate, but you're not going to like preach to them. But more importantly, I mean, Assagioli himself, he says that psychosynthesis isn't it's not a dogma, it's not a philosophy, it's not a religion, it's an experience.
I suppose my comment to that is it's all very well to say that, I think,
yes,
one can always say that, but I think almost any system of ideas has potential to be a belief system.
Well, there's always beliefs. I'm not saying that means you don't have beliefs, and you don't have assumptions, but you need to hold them really lightly and recognize that. This is what I think anyway. You need to hold them lightly because any belief system is going to be a simplification of the richness of experience, and that's why I really like Assagioli's embrace of mystery with a capital M. Because that's what he says alongside it. It's not a dogma, it's not a religion, it's not a philosophy. It isn't. We take people to the door of the mystery with a capital M, and that's it. You don't tell them what's beyond the door. So
just before we go, I suppose I think it's quite an important point, this, because I think you're saying something quite radical then. And I'm not sure Assagioli would have gone as far as that, because, I mean, belief in the self,
yes,
is a core underpinning belief in the project of therapy more generally. I think
therapy more generally, not just psychosynthesis.
No, I think psychotherapy.
Wonderful.
Well, I mean, there's different versions of what that means in different modalities, but the prioritization of the autonomy of the self in however if you see that as individuation in Jung, or if you see that as the ego, the importance of the ego in Freud, it's there. And I suppose it's an issue I'm thinking about a lot recently in relation to collectivist kind of models of identity, and to what extent some of the assumptions in therapy have played in reinforcing a kind of very kind of atomized self view of the self. So I'm just, I suppose I see some of that in this model.
Oh yeah, it's definitely there in this model. Well, let's talk about center separation. So the idea is that the I is a center of consciousness and will. So the idea is that feelings and thoughts and everything and memories, they come and go, but there is this unchanging essence, this center, the I. It's called different things: the I, the personal self, or just self with a small s. Is always there and it's unchanging and is the center of who you are. Maybe, but as an experience, so not just in the abstract, not just as a belief system, as an experience, what is that? And that's where we perhaps get into trouble, because in places in the psychosynthesis literature anyway, that centered experience
Mm.
gets described as a particular state, which is to say a particular content of consciousness, which is just usually it's sort of connoted as a sort of you're confident, you're centered, which means you're calm, you're collected,
Mm-hmm.
you have perspective on your experience, you're not being reactive. But again, that's a particular experience, and that while that might be the outcome of disidentification, the process of disidentification, that vulnerable space in the chrysalis of limitation and helplessness, will not be one of confidence and control. Maybe when you become a butterfly. So again, it misses out on the process. And you're trying to create a particular experience, perhaps. But then that means you separate off from the other experiences. So you might be separating off from your vulnerability and your anxiety to try and have this centered experience. And that's where the idealization of disidentification creeps in, because it does get written off sometimes as a sort of state where you're free to move and you have complete control over how you think and feel, and you can move in any particular direction. And it's almost like connoted that it's a desirable state to just dwell in as much as you can, and that's the point of psychosynthesis in a way.
Yeah.
But your bigger question, which is a really fun one, because that's where I go in the book, because there's other ways you could describe the self, which in a way that doesn't have a center. So lots of ecological analogies. The murmuration, like a flock of starlings in the night sky, it doesn't have a center. There's no controller bird in the middle telling everybody to keep up. Similarly with the body, I mean, we used to perhaps assume that the brain was the center of control, but increasingly it's becoming clear that's not the case. So consciousness and will is sort of distributed through something that you could call self. But is there a center? Does there need to be a center? These are interesting questions, which is what I'll get into later in the book, and present psychosynthesis in a way that doesn't focus on finding I or personal self. It's more about finding the story that you find yourself in, which is contextualizes your experience.
Yeah. Is this? I mean, do you think that a lot of this are questions of language?
100%.
Like, if we had the right words, we'd be closer.
Well, I think it's a question of, what I say in the book is that language is massively important, because language, particularly if you're a therapist, I mean, it's talking therapy, and how you use language will directly influence how you shape the client's experience. How they feel understood, how they feel met is through the words that you use. But then also backing up like the theory that the therapist uses to then connect to the client. That's another set of language, the theoretical language. And that's important too. And I think we can always be striving or moving towards a better theoretical description. And a better theoretical description for me would be one that describes the experience that it purports to explain better than another theory. And that's what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm trying to point out where Assagioli actually really nails that. He really does describe experience really, really well, when he's not caught up in a more sort of analytical, abstract lexicon.
And we've got to acknowledge that, there's a layer to this, which maybe, Assagioli himself would have had more language or awareness of these issues had he been kind of developing his ideas later in the 20th century or in the 21st century even. But to recognise his own participation in all of this. So is that what we're really talking about often, I think, when we're talking about these differences in Assagioli's perspective, is that you're revealing not only a divergence from principle, you're revealing Assagioli's identifications. When we're talking about the certain presentations of I, certain presentations as disidentification, I think what we're seeing is Assagioli's urge to find a safe observer point.
Yes.
To be able to make these statements about experience and stuff. He's attached to a kind of more 19th century view of the observer, the scientific observer. That comes out.
I think that could bring us to control separation. Could track that onto the 4 separations.
Mm-hmm.
So the danger of control separation, which comes with disidentification, is that you're a center of consciousness and control. It's in the language, right? And from this center of consciousness and will, which has the ability to control and dominate, I think he says.
Yeah.
Definitely the language of control. The outcome of disidentification is that you are in control. You, the I, the personal self, created as a result of disidentification, have control. And if you map that onto what you've just said, that's what empirical science is all about. It's about making observations with the purpose of better understanding, but also controlling the material world. And we get into that in chapter 3 quite a bit. But for now, it is there. It's like the eye is a scientific observer who's able to stand back and objectively notice experience. So it's just an assumption that somehow you can be separate from your experience, but still be that experience, noticing that experience. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit tricksy, because the danger of that is that you can think that you're in control, and then you end up just trying to manipulate the experience that you want and avoiding the experience that you don't want, and then you separate off from who you are to some extent. And again, that's a separation, not a synthesis. But go on.
No, just another an idealized state of self-mastery is what you described it as.
And self-mastery is the least of it, because the real danger of that one is that you end up trying to control other people. Or your clients as well. You try and make them have experiences. You think you can control your clients.
There's an obvious connection with the will here, isn't there, as well? We're touching on that. One question came up in this bit for me was kind of thinking about contemporary stuff, contemporary themes of self-mastery, which is in the very popular language around self-regulation, often drawing on neurological models. And I suppose I was wondering, well, how does all this fit in there? Because there's an assumption, I suppose, of being able to disidentify from stuff, and I don't know. I'm just wondering about how we fit in trauma. And what are the implications of having an abstract versus an experiential understanding of disidentification in that context, in the context of trauma, in the context of self-regulation of our, nervous system responses, all of that.
Well, let's keep it simple. If you're traumatized, what is that? That's going to be a state of identification to some extent. That's going to protect you from facing into the trauma, processing the trauma. You'll have split off or separated from the worst of the trauma somehow. So the therapeutic process would require creating some kind of safety and trust, and an ability to self-regulate, in your language, self-soothe, or self-regulate in that language that you were drawing upon, self-soothe is my kind of way of thinking about it, to slowly begin to disidentify from that state of kind of holding on in fear, and to begin to slowly, gradually let in these difficult experiences, and begin to digest them, and maybe come into a relationship with them, with the memories or whatever, in a new way, not making them go away, but just like taking the power out of them, through remembering them differently. Is that a self-regulation? I mean, is there a self? I mean, that's kind of where I go to. I mean, cards on the table. I've got a history in Buddhism, so that's a big influence on me. And if you know anything about Buddhism, it's about there's no fixed self. There is a self, but it's not a fixed self. It's not an enduring self. It's not an everlasting self. If you go looking for it, you don't find it. That's kind of what I'm bringing to the table here. I've not found this self, and I'm not actually trying to find it. That's not how I think about psychosynthesis anymore. But I'm still doing psychosynthesis, you see, because for me, psychosynthesis doesn't rest upon the self as a center of consciousness and will. It rests upon the principles of synthesis and experience.
But would you say that position is in Assagioli's? Is that a principle?
I think he's got a belief system that there is a self. Yeah, that comes through again and again and again. And while with one side of his mouth he says that he's down on psychosynthesis being a belief system, with the other side of his mouth he offers a belief system, which is that there's a self that's unchanging. And in chapter 3, again, which we'll get to, I talk about that much more and where that might come from. But I think it comes from a number of the influences that he draws upon. So this is all very heterodox and unusual to be talking about psychosynthesis in this way. But you know,
and yet rooted in Assagioli's own words.
It's all, there's basis for what I'm saying in what Assagioli writes, and also there's the other side as well.
Well, it makes sense.
Absolutely, because I mean he talks about the body as the perfect example of synthesis he talks about the analogy of the body and how the organs and the cells and all the different apparatus come together as an organic whole. He calls it a biosynthesis, and he uses that as an analogy for a psychological synthesis, where you're bringing together all the elements. There's no center in the body, like we said before, and where he writes about that, he doesn't talk about the body having a center at all. And yet elsewhere, when he talks about synthesis, he talks about it in a very different way. So again, this is no example of the more experiential synthesis, because I think it's fairly straightforward to recognize that, okay, synthesis is like, I experience calm, and now I'm experiencing other feelings, and I'm putting them together, and now I'm a more complex system, I'm a greater whole. That's a fairly experientially recognizable event that people will know from their lives, where a new experience comes in and they have to sort of like join that up to what they've got going already. The other way of synthesis that Assagioli talks about, and this is one of the teaching experiences, he talks about synthesis as a synthesis of opposites, where you've got two things that are in opposition, there's a tension between them, and they fuse or become unified into a third, which combines the poles but unifies them. So it's like they sort of disappear in a way, and they become something else in this higher synthesis. So let's kind of ground that. So it's kind of like, you like to think, you're identified with thinking, and you're in opposition to feelings. You don't want to have feelings, so you like to think about things, and when feelings arise, you push them away. So, I mean, that's an easy thing to recognize in people. when they come to therapy, or the other way around even, right? So in this sense of synthesis, what we're trying to do is bring together feelings and thoughts to unify them, fuse them together into a higher third. Which is fine. I mean, that's based on the philosophy of dialecticism, for those philosophy nerds out there. So you've got thesis, antithesis, and that comes together in a thesis. So it's very different to lots of different elements. Now you've just got two elements. And it's very different to all those elements are there in a greater whole. Now they've fused somehow into a singular instead of two things. Conscious, unconscious, love, will, all these kind of oppositions. The problem is that's a good orientation. I think that's a good beginning way of thinking about things. Is this person more comfortable with feelings or thoughts? Is this more a unconscious difficulty or a conscious thing that we can think through? But obviously there's other elements in the mix that are not just described by feelings and thoughts. There's the body. There's perceptions of the world. There's like intuition. There's imagination. There's lots of things going on that might be separated from or ignored if we overly focus on just two things. And then also, if we're trying to sort of fuse them together, I don't know what fusing feelings and thoughts together means, because you're still going to have feelings and thoughts. I mean, they're not separate from each other. So you do want...
Yeah, I mean, it's... I suppose I understand dialecticism slightly differently in that it's a kind of developmental one. So
yeah,
it's not that thesis and antithesis come into existence at once. Basically, the thesis creates the conditions for the emergence of antithesis, which is basically an expression of the contradictions in the thesis. So if, I suppose in the example you're giving, if one is very identified with thinking, then you are kind of repressing affect, repressing feeling, which leads to a whole set of other consequences and symptoms, and it's the clash between the two of them. It's the clash between this kind of feeling repression of feelings and an identification of thought that has to be resolved in the synthesis, whatever that is. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure how to articulate that, but it's more as it's not as like black and white kind of opposites. It's opposites that they
emerge from each other.
There's an opposition between, but it's a developing opposition and resolving an opposition and resolving that kind of process.
So depending on how you use that could be a really interesting way to work. But the main thing is to understand that that's a different way of understanding synthesis to the more sort of biological or systemic way of understanding synthesis, and that there's these two different things. Hey Ryan, but I'm just noticing the time, and it would be good to bring in one more thing before we close, which is like a big thing that runs all the way through this chapter, which is that these teachings or experiences, disidentification, superconscious, transpersonal self, you learn more about them as time goes by, according to Assagioli, by noticing how they interrelate. And the connections between them, and I make quite a lot out of that in the chapter, as an antidote to how sometimes they're presented or understood, which is that there is something called the will, and that's an experience, and then there's something called disidentification, and that's another experience, and there's something called transpersonal self, and that's another experience. They're not separate experiences. They are different aspects or ways of describing the same experience, because you only really have one experience. An experience comes to you as a whole, and I just think that's genius that Assagioli's able to delineate these different aspects and help you to see how they're interconnected, and that really comes across in how he writes about them, and indeed how I was taught about them, and indeed how I teach them. But for a long time, like for example, I start the chapter, I say, when I started teaching psychosynthesis, I used to joke with my students that I've only got one or two things to teach to them, and I'm just going to teach them in different ways. So it's kind of like I'd teach on the will, but I'd be teaching the same thing as when I taught on disidentification or like transpersonal self. And it was a bit of a joke, and it was a dangerous joke, it felt at the time, because I felt like it was my job to teach the students about the will. This weekend's about the will. It's not about disidentification. It's not about transpersonal self. It's not about ideal model. It's about the will. So teach them the will. But there was a little voice whispering in the background, don't you see? They're all interconnected. It's a synthesis. And the danger is that we focus on the parts in isolation and miss out on the relationships that hold them all together. And that's there in Assagioli, in this wonderful training document. He just says that very succinctly. Reflect on how they're interconnected and how they interrelate. So it's a bit like when you start to drive a car, it's like foot on clutch, engage gear, check mirror, disengage clutch, foot on accelerator. It's all very clunky to begin with, but you don't want to stay in that stage. You want to be able to bring it all together and drive smoothly. It's the same with psychosynthesis. And I think it's a really important piece to get your head around, that the personal self that we've been talking about is a consciousness and will. So straight away, will is intermingled, is in synthesis with personal self. And that as you disidentify, you develop awareness and will, consciousness and will. So your personal self grows. So they're all connected together. The superconscious is an interesting one, because in many ways you can understand the superconscious from an experiential basis as the eruption of experiences beyond your identification, which leads to a disidentification. And the transpersonal self, what is that? That's the more mysterious end of the chart, which often gets nearly all books on psychosynthesis say that you can't say very much about the transpersonal self, or something like that, because Assagioli said that at one point, or a couple of points. He says, "Oh, my dear boy, you can't describe transpersonal self." So I quote him saying that, but then I also quote him telling you quite a few nice juicy hints as to what transpersonal self is, and it's grounded in an experiential understanding. It's not abstract. It's not some other realm. It's basically the context, the psychological context within which the personal self exists. It's the web of relationships. You never meet transpersonal self one-to-one. It's not like another person meeting a person. It's not like you meet like some grey-bearded old man on a cloud or something. That's transpersonal self. Heaven forbid. It's more that through your relationships to your therapist and your dog and your partner and your family and your culture, transpersonal self is communicating with you, is calling you, is offering you possibilities within those relationships. And it's noticing those relationships and working with those relationships that the fabric of who we are complexifies, I suppose, or develops. And we join ourselves up ever more to this encompassing web of relationships, this psychological context, which is quite exciting. And I think that's the transpersonal element, trans meaning beyond the person. So it's like psychosynthesis isn't just about your inner subjective, personal, psychological life. It includes that, but it places that in the field of all these other relationships. It's kind of like psychological life's happening around you as well as within you. And that's just like deeply inspiring to me. And that's kind of where I went with. I really run with that in the book and think through where that might lead. Because it's like going back to what you were interestingly bringing in about self and the assumption of self. think if we can move away from that by thinking about psychological life more contextually, rather than sort of intrapersonally, and just how we're like sustained and created and intimately joined up. It's like we're constituted by all these relationships. So there isn't a core that's generating our experience. It's more like we're the result of this complex experience that we're passing through, which doesn't have a center, everybody, I'm afraid. Hence the subtitle for the book, Psychosynthesis Psychotherapy in Experiential Context.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alan, I think, I've certainly got other things I could ask or respond or go on those topics, but I think maybe we should wrap up.
Save some of it for next time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So next time on the Psychosynthesis Sessions, the podcast series, Ryan and Alan will be discussing chapter 2, which is where we turn the principles of experiential synthesis back upon the techniques of psychosynthesis. So it's kind of like not just how to think about what psychosynthesis is, but how do you do psychosynthesis? What's the method?
Okay.
So look out for that, everybody. Thanks for listening. Do subscribe and like and share and all those good podcasty things. Much appreciated.
Right. Well, until next time.
Adios.
Bye.